The longhouse of Jarl Magnus Eriksson stood like a weathered giant against the harsh Norwegian coastline, its timber walls blackened by countless winters. Within its great hall, the central fire crackled weakly, casting dancing shadows across the carved wooden pillars that bore the weight of his authority. Magnus sat in his high seat, carved from oak and adorned with intricate knotwork, his ice-blue eyes fixed on the flames, as if they held answers to questions he refused to ask. Astrid moved silently through the hall, her soft leather shoes making no sound on the rush-covered floor. Once, those same eyes that now stared past her had burned with desire when they first met at her father's hall 3 summers ago. She had been the prize that sealed an alliance between their clans, her beauty and noble bloodline cementing Magnus's position among the coastal jarls. Now she felt like a ghost haunting her own home. The marriage feast had been grand, with mead flowing like rivers and skalds singing their praises. Magnus had placed a silver arm ring upon her wrist and declared her the jewel of his hall. But as the seasons turned and no child quickened in her womb, his attention had shifted elsewhere. The daily raids along the Frankish coast, the endless meetings with his warband, the planning of next summer's expeditions, all these matters seemed to hold more interest for him than his wife. Astrid paused near the loom where she spent most of her days, her fingers tracing the half-finished tapestry that depicted ships sailing toward distant shores. The threads were dyed in rich blues and reds, colours that matched the sunset over the fjord. She had hoped that creating something beautiful might draw Magnus's eye, might remind him of the woman who shared his bed and bore his name. Instead, he barely glanced at her work when he passed. The great doors of the hall creaked open, allowing a gust of salt-tinged air to sweep through the chamber. Magnus's warriors filed in from their evening training, their voices loud with laughter and boasts of their prowess with sword and axe. Among them walked Gunnar the Bold, a man whose reputation in battle was matched only by his skill in wooing women. His dark hair was braided with silver rings earned in combat, and his green eyes held a warmth that Astrid had not seen in her husband's gaze for many moons. As the men settled at the long tables for their evening meal, servants hurried to bring horns of ale and platters of roasted meat. Astrid took her place beside Magnus on the raised platform, her hands folded in her lap as she had been taught. The conversation flowed around her like water around a stone. Talk of ship repairs, weather patterns for sailing, and rumours of wealthy monasteries along the English coast. Magnus leaned forward, his attention completely absorbed by Gunnar's tale of a recent scouting mission. The warrior's voice carried easily through the hall as he described the movements of Frankish patrols and the best landing spots for their dragon-proud ships. Astrid watched her husband's face come alive with interest, saw the fire return to his eyes as he planned future raids and conquests. She rose quietly from her seat, knowing her absence would go unnoticed. The evening air outside was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine forests and the distant sound of waves against the rocky shore. Above, the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, their cold light reflecting off the still waters of the fjord. Astrid walked to the edge of the wooden platform that extended over the water, her woolen cloak wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She wondered if this was to be her life forever, watching from the shadows as her husband pursued glory and gold, being little more than a beautiful ornament in his hall. The alliance her marriage had secured remained strong, but what of her own happiness? What of the love she had hoped to find in this union? The sound of footsteps on the wooden planks behind her made her turn. Gunnar approached slowly, his expression thoughtful in the pale starlight. In his weathered hands, he carried something small and delicate, a cluster of white meadow flowers, their petals still fresh with evening dew. "My lady," Gunnar said softly, his voice barely audible above the gentle lapping of waves against the wooden posts below. "I found these growing wild near the old stone circle up the valley. They reminded me of your grace." Astrid turned fully to face him, surprise flickering across her features. No one had spoken to her with such gentleness in months, certainly not with the respect his tone conveyed. The flowers in his hands were simple meadowsweet, their tiny white blooms clustered together like stars fallen to earth. In the harsh world of warriors and raids, such a delicate gesture seemed almost otherworldly. "You should not be here alone with me," she whispered, though she made no move to leave. "If Magnus were to see—" "Your husband is deep in his cups and his plans for the next raid," Gunnar replied, stepping closer until she could see the earnestness in his green eyes. "He speaks of nothing but the monastery gold waiting across the sea. When did he last speak to you of anything that matters? Astrid's breath caught in her throat. It was dangerous talk, the kind that could see a man exiled or worse. Yet she found herself unable to turn away from the warmth in his voice, the attention she had craved for so long. She reached out tentatively and accepted the flowers, their sweet fragrance filling her senses. "These are beautiful," she said, bringing them to her face. "I had forgotten that such simple things could bring joy." Gunnar moved to stand beside her at the platform's edge, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "A woman like you should never be forgotten, my lady. You bring light to this hall, though some may be too blind to see it." Inside the longhouse, Magnus's voice boomed with laughter at some jest, the sound carrying clearly through the night air. Astrid winced at the contrast, her husband's easy mirth with his warriors while she stood alone under the stars, holding flowers from another man. "I should return," she said, though her feet remained planted on the wooden planks. "The servants will wonder where I have gone." "The servants know their place, as do I," Gunnar said quietly. "But seeing you stand here alone night after night, watching the water while your husband plans his next adventure, it troubles me." Astrid looked up at him sharply. "You have been watching me. It is hard not to notice grace when it moves through a hall full of rough men," he admitted. "Your kindness to the servants, the way you tend the hearth fires, the beautiful work of your hands at the loom. These things do not go unseen by everyone." The flowers trembled in her hands. No one had praised her needlework since her mother had taught her the patterns years ago. No one had noticed the small kindnesses she showed to the thralls and servants who worked in Magnus's hall. The validation of being truly seen by another person was overwhelming. "Gunnar," she began, then stopped, unsure of what she wanted to say. "I know I speak out of turn," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "but you deserve better than to be treated as furniture in your own home. You are a Jarl's daughter, a woman of noble blood and gentle heart. Any man should count himself fortunate to earn even a smile from you." The sound of benches scraping against the floor inside indicated that the evening's drinking was winding down. Soon, Magnus would retire, likely without even noticing his wife's absence. The thought brought a familiar ache to her chest. "I must go," Astrid said, clutching the flowers more tightly. "Thank you for these. They will brighten my chamber." "My lady," Gunnar called softly as she turned to leave, "if you ever need someone to listen, to truly see you as you deserve to be seen, I am here." Astrid paused at the threshold of the great hall, her heart pounding. Through the doorway, she could see Magnus already heading toward their private chamber, his steps steady despite the ale he had consumed. He would expect her to follow soon, to play the dutiful wife before he fell into sleep and dreams of conquest. She pressed the flowers to her heart and made her choice, stepping into the warmth of the hall, while Gunnar's words echoed in her mind. 3 days passed like autumn leaves on the wind, each one bringing subtle changes to the rhythm of the hall. Astrid found herself stealing glances at Gunnar during meals, their shared secret warming her like embers in her chest. The meadowsweet flowers sat in a small clay vessel by her bed, their sweet scent a constant reminder of kindness freely given. Magnus remained oblivious to the shift in his wife's demeanour. His attention was consumed by preparations for a major raid planned for the following spring. Maps drawn on bark and hide covered the great table, marking monasteries along the English coast that promised rich plunder. His warband gathered daily to discuss ship repairs, weapon maintenance, and the recruitment of additional warriors from neighbouring settlements. On the 4th morning, Astrid sat at her loom as usual, her fingers working the coloured threads into intricate patterns. The tapestry had grown since Gunnar's gift, the ships in her weaving now sailing toward a shore decorated with tiny white flowers along the border. She hummed softly as she worked, a melody her mother had taught her long ago. "You seem different lately," observed Sigrid, an older woman who served as head of the household servants. She approached with a basket of newly spun wool, her weathered face kind but observant. "There is colour in your cheeks again." Astrid's hands paused in their work. "The changing season brings new energy to us all," she replied carefully. Sigrid set down her basket and studied the tapestry with appreciation. "This border work is exquisite. The Jarl should be proud to display such skill in his hall." "Magnus has little interest in domestic arts," Astrid said, her voice carrying a note of resignation that she immediately regretted revealing. The older woman's expression softened with understanding. "Men see only what serves their immediate needs, my lady. But some have eyes for beauty in all its forms. Before Astrid could respond, the great doors burst open with unusual force. Magnus strode into the hall, his face dark with anger, and his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. Behind him came several of his most trusted warriors, their expressions grim. The normal bustle of morning activities ceased, as every person in the hall turned to watch their Jarl. "Where is Gunnar?" Magnus's voice boomed across the chamber, causing the flames in the central hearth to flicker as if in fear. One of the younger warriors, Eric Ironhand, stepped forward. "He was checking the ship moorings at dawn, my lord. He should return soon." Magnus began pacing like a caged wolf, his leather boots striking the floor with aggressive rhythm. "Olaf the shipwright came to me with interesting news this morning. He spoke of seeing my wife walking alone by the water's edge in the evening hours, and of a certain warrior who seemed to know her movements well." Astrid's blood turned to ice in her veins. Her fingers clutched the shuttle so tightly that her knuckles went white. Around the hall, servants found urgent tasks that required their immediate attention, their instincts warning them to avoid their master's wrath. "Surely there is nothing unusual in that, my lord," Eric said carefully. "Lady Astrid often walks in the evening air. It is good for her health. Alone?" Magnus whirled to face him, his blue eyes blazing. "My wife walks alone while warriors in my service know her habits well enough to predict her presence. What manner of household am I keeping?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Astrid rose slowly from her loom, her legs unsteady beneath her. She had known this moment would come, had felt it approaching like a storm on the horizon. The question was whether she would face it with the courage of her noble blood, or cower like a thrall caught stealing bread. "My lord husband," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent hall, "if you have questions about my conduct, perhaps you should ask me directly, rather than interrogating your loyal warriors." Magnus turned to look at his wife, as if seeing her for the first time in months. His gaze swept over her face, noting the defiant lift of her chin and the steady meeting of her eyes with his own. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across his features, as if he were recognizing a stranger. "Very well," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Tell me, wife, what draws you to walk alone in the darkness? What thoughts occupy your mind during these solitary journeys?" The great doors opened again before Astrid could respond, and Gunnar entered the hall. He took in the scene immediately, the tension crackling through the air, Magnus's aggressive stance, and Astrid standing pale but proud beside her loom. His hand moved instinctively toward his weapon before he forced himself to relax. "My Jarl," he said, bowing his head respectfully. "You summoned me?" Magnus's eyes narrowed as he studied his warrior's face. "Indeed I did. It seems we have matters to discuss concerning the proper boundaries between a warrior and his lord's wife." Gunnar straightened to his full height, meeting Magnus's fierce gaze without flinching. Years of facing Saxon shields and Frankish spears had taught him that showing fear only invited death. "I have always served you with honor, my Jarl. If someone has spoken against me, I would hear these accusations plainly." Magnus circled him slowly, like a predator sizing up prey. "Olaf tells me you know my wife's evening habits well, that you have been seen speaking with her alone by the water. In my hall, such familiarity between a warrior and his lord's woman is concerning." "I have shown Lady Astrid nothing but the respect due to her station," Gunnar replied evenly. "If offering comfort to a lonely woman through kind words is a crime, then I am guilty. But I have done nothing to dishonor her or your marriage bed." A dangerous silence fell over the hall. Astrid watched her husband's face, seeing the war between his pride and his reason. Magnus was no fool. He knew that Gunnar spoke truth about her loneliness, even if he refused to acknowledge his own role in creating it. "Comfort?" Magnus's voice dripped with menace. "What comfort does my wife require that her husband cannot provide?" "The comfort of being seen," Gunnar said quietly, his words carrying to every corner of the silent hall. "The comfort of conversation that goes beyond the needs of the household. The comfort of knowing her thoughts and feelings matter to someone." Magnus's hand tightened on his sword hilt. "You dare suggest I neglect my duties as a husband?" "I suggest nothing, my lord. I merely answer your questions with truth." Astrid could bear the tension no longer. She stepped forward, her chin raised with the pride of her noble bloodline. "Enough! You want truth, husband? Then hear it from my own lips." Both men turned to stare at her, Magnus with growing fury, and Gunnar with barely concealed admiration for her courage. The servants pressed themselves against the walls, knowing that witnessing this confrontation could cost them dearly if they appeared to take sides. "For 3 years I have been your wife in name," Astrid continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I have managed your household, honored your guests, and asked nothing in return but the basic courtesy due to my station. Yet you treat me with less attention than you show your favorite hunting hound." Magnus took a step toward her, his face flushing with anger. "Woman, you forget yourself." "Do I?" Astrid laughed bitterly. "When did you last ask about my thoughts? When did you last notice the work of my hands or inquire about my well-being? You know every detail of next season's raids, but cannot tell me the color of the dress I wore yesterday. My concerns are with providing for this household and protecting our lands, and mine are with surviving the loneliness of being invisible in my own home." Astrid's eyes blazed with 3 years of suppressed hurt and frustration. "Gunnar brought me flowers. Simple meadowsweet found growing wild. Such a small gesture, yet it was the first time in months anyone had thought to offer me kindness." Magnus whirled toward Gunnar, his sword singing as it cleared its sheath. "You gave my wife gifts. You courted her behind my back?" Gunnar made no move to draw his own weapon, though his muscles tensed for action. "Flowers are not courtship, Magnus. They are recognition of worth, something you have forgotten how to give." The point of Magnus's blade hovered inches from Gunnar's throat. Around the hall, other warriors began to shift nervously, hands moving toward weapons. A fight between these two skilled men would leave one dead, and the other exiled or executed, destroying the careful bonds that held the warband together. "You think you can steal my wife's affections with pretty gestures?" Magnus snarled. "Her affections were never yours to lose," Gunnar replied calmly. "They were yours to earn and keep, but you have been too busy chasing gold across the sea to notice the treasure in your own hall." Magnus raised his sword, murder clear in his eyes. But before he could strike, Astrid threw herself between the two men, her arms spread wide to protect them both from their own pride and anger. "Stop," she cried. "Would you spill blood over flowers? Would you destroy your friendship and your honor over wounded pride?" Magnus stared down at his wife, seeing her clearly for the first time in years. Her face was flushed with emotion, her dark hair falling loose from its careful braids. She stood between two dangerous men without fear, protecting them both from the consequences of their confrontation. "Choose," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the sword point mere feet away. "Choose to be the man I married, the leader your people deserve, or choose to be a jealous fool who destroys everything good in his life." Magnus stood frozen, his sword trembling in his grip as Astrid's words echoed through the great hall. The weight of 3 years of neglect pressed down upon him like stones in a burial mound. Around them, his warriors watched in tense silence, witnessing their Jarl face a choice that would define not only his marriage, but his leadership. Slowly, Magnus lowered his weapon, the steel point touching the rush-covered floor with a soft whisper. His ice-blue eyes never left his wife's face as understanding dawned like sunrise over the fjord. The woman standing before him was not the meek bride he had taken 3 summers ago, but a Jarl's daughter with fire in her blood and steel in her spine. "Astrid," he said quietly, her name carrying weight it had not held in years. "I have been blind." Gunnar remained motionless, though tension still coiled in his muscles. He had seen Magnus in battle, knew the man's capacity for both honor and violence. This moment balanced on a knife's edge, and one wrong word could still see blood spilled on the hall's wooden floor. "You have been absent," Astrid corrected, her voice gentler now but still firm. "In body you were here, but your heart sailed with every ship that left our harbour. Your mind planned every raid while your wife sat forgotten by your own hearth." Magnus sheathed his sword with deliberate care, the familiar weight settling against his hip. He looked around the hall, seeing his household through new eyes, the servants who scurried to avoid his notice, the warriors who respected his battle skill, but perhaps questioned his wisdom as a husband, and the wife whose grace had once made him the envy of every Jarl along the coast. "Gunnar," Magnus said, turning to face his warrior, "you spoke truth, though it cut deep. A man's greatest treasure should never be left unguarded or unappreciated." "My lord," Gunnar replied carefully, "I meant no disrespect to you or your marriage. I saw only a good woman in need of kindness, and you provided what I had failed to give." Magnus's voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "For that, I should thank you rather than threaten you with steel." The admission sent ripples of surprise through the watching crowd. A Jarl's acknowledgement of fault before his warriors was rare, requiring courage that rivaled any shown in battle. Eric Ironhand nodded approvingly, while old Sigrid smiled from her place among the servants. Magnus stepped closer to his wife, noting details he had overlooked for too long. The delicate embroidery on her dress that had been her own handiwork, the careful arrangement of her hair that spoke of pride despite neglect, the flowers from Gunnar's gift that she had woven into her tapestry border. "I remember the woman I married," he said, reaching out to touch her face with surprising gentleness. "You brought laughter to my hall and wisdom to my council table. You made alliance into love. Or so I thought, until I let ambition blind me to your worth." Astrid's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I never asked for gold or glory, Magnus. I asked only to be seen, to be valued for more than the political alliance my father's name provided." "You asked for what any worthy woman deserves from her husband," Magnus replied. "Attention, respect, and care. Things I gave freely to my ships and weapons while neglecting the greatest treasure in my hall." He turned to address his assembled warriors, his voice carrying the authority that had made men follow him across dangerous seas. "Let this be a lesson to us all. A man who conquers distant shores but loses his own hearth has won nothing of lasting value. Wealth can be stolen, glory fades, but the love of a good woman is a prize beyond measure." Gunnar stepped forward, his head bowed respectfully. "My Jarl, if my actions have taught you to see Lady Astrid's worth, then perhaps some good has come from this difficult day." Magnus studied his warrior's face, reading the sincerity there. "You are a man of honor, Gunnar the Bold. Your loyalty to my household included protecting what I had foolishly abandoned. For that, you have my gratitude rather than my anger." The tension in the hall began to dissolve like morning mist over water. Servants resumed their duties with relieved whispers, while warriors exchanged meaningful glances. They had witnessed their leader's growth from jealous husband to wise Jarl, a transformation that would strengthen his authority rather than diminish it. "Now," Magnus said, taking Astrid's hands in his calloused grip, "I must begin the work of earning back what I nearly lost through my own blindness. My lady wife, will you walk with me by the water this evening? I find myself curious about your thoughts after years of shameful neglect." Astrid smiled through her tears, the expression transforming her face with radiant joy. "I would be honored, my lord husband. Perhaps you might also like to see the tapestry I have been weaving." Ships sailing toward shores decorated with meadowsweet flowers. "I would like that very much," Magnus replied. And for the first time in years, his smile reached his eyes. After all, a wise warrior once told me that some have eyes for beauty in all its forms. As the couple moved toward her loom together, Gunnar quietly slipped from the hall, his duty complete. The storm had passed, leaving behind the promise of fairer weather and the hope that even the strongest walls could be mended with understanding and genuine care.